Perhaps the greatest irony of this whole process is that had the three laboratories performed the chemical analysis that was part of their original protocol back in 1988, had they performed that chemical analysis, had they looked at these samples under the microscope and then chemically, as Ray Rogers did, perhaps they too would have found this anomaly in this area and gone back and said, look, we do need to get some samples from elsewhere on the shroud. But that's not what happened. What happened was they were satisfied with the single sample, they didn't perform the chemical analysis, and considering that this was claimed to be a blind study, meaning that they weren't supposed to know which samples were which, yet by their own admission, they stated that they didn't do the chemical analysis because they knew which samples were the shroud. So somehow there's a discrepancy that I won't go into. Now, when we think about it, all that Rogers really did was finish what they had started by getting a reserved portion of the same sample that had been cut. By performing both the microscopic and chemical analysis, Rogers was able to determine that this area of the Shroud of Turin was different from the rest of the cloth. Now, that's significant because in essence, what was tested was an area that had been repaired, rewoven, patched, whatever words you want to use. But that brings me to the subject of the visible detection of this, because some of the authorities in Turin continue to insist that Ray Rogers is wrong and this is impossible because they don't see a repair. Well, that is a very valid point, because usually when something's rewoven, if you look on the backside, you'll see threads sticking out. In other words, we only, in modern day reweaving, repair the side that is to be viewed, the outside of your trousers. When you burn a hole in them and you get them rewoven, the outside looks perfect and you can't find it, but on the inside you can see where the repair was made. Well, interestingly enough, in the 15 and 1600s, the French had perfected something that they called invisible reweaving. Now, when this first was mentioned by Benford and Marino, most people just sort of waved their hands and said, please, if this was there, we would have seen this by now. Well, Benford and Marino quoted from a reference, one of their references was a book written by one of the curators of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a textile expert in his own right, and he devoted 2 entire chapters to French invisible reweaving. And it was perfected in the French court at the same time that the shroud was documented to be in France. And secondly, according to the expert, this type of reweaving is so perfect, and they had perfected it on both sides of the woven cloth, that the only way one could detect this would be with a microscope and to know exactly what to look for and where to look for it, or otherwise it would remain invisible. It's that good. Well, it's very hard for skeptics to believe that such a technique could be even in existence, especially in medieval times. And yet, there is absolute scientific evidence to the fact that this technique was performed and the shroud was in fact in France at this very same time. So there seems to be a correlation that obviously if there is a repair and the shroud was in France, what better object than the Shroud of Turin would the King of France or the French court choose to use this spectacular technique on than this cloth purported to be a relic of Jesus?
Ray Rogers had not only blown a hole in the carbon dating evidence, frequently used by doubters to discredit the shroud, the only piece of hard scientific evidence in fact to cast any serious doubts on its authenticity. But he had also enlisted the help of textile experts to explain the results that he was seeing. But what would the international scientific community make of these findings?
So what conclusion can we draw from all of this? Well, there is no doubt that the work of Ray Rogers, which, by the way, isn't just published in a TV documentary or a website or a magazine or some commercial book, Ray Rogers submitted his research on this anomalous sample to one of the finest chemistry journals in all of the world, a journal named Thermochemica Acta. And they spent 7 months reviewing his work, making him make changes, going back and making him redo certain parts of his experimentation, furthering his documentation of what he'd found, and after 7 months, his paper was published in January of 2005. So we now have the first piece of peer-reviewed scientific evidence that's appeared in a refereed scientific journal proving that the sample used in 1988 for the radiocarbon dating of the shroud was in fact anomalous, did not represent the main body of the shroud cloth, and consequently the Shroud of Turin itself was not dated, but only this repaired corner was dated, which was obviously a synthesis of both old and new threads, yielding the medieval date that was concluded by the 1988 radiocarbon dating. So that test, if we just look purely at the science, forget about all the other commercial aspects and the bloggers and the pundits, looking solely at the science, this is the first conclusive evidence in the referee science that indicates the Shroud of Turin itself was not dated, but a repair was. Now, there are many people who disagree with this, and they'll continue to disagree, and my answer to that is simply this: that if somebody finds something wrong in what Ray did, Ray Rogers himself would have been the first to say, publish it, get it into the literature, and I'll change my mind, as he had done on more than one occasion in the world of the Shroud. As new evidence came in, Rogers was flexible and was willing to accept that his original opinions or conclusions might have been wrong, and was willing to change as the evidence showed otherwise. That's what I call real science. I've been privileged to be a part of that, and that's why I firmly believe that the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin in 1988 did not in fact date the actual shroud, but dated this repaired corner.
Real science performed by the Shroud of Turin research team in 1978 and continued by the likes of Barry Schwartz and Ray Rogers indicates that not only is the shroud not a fake, but also that the main piece of evidence against it, the radiocarbon dating, is significantly flawed as to be practically useless. As Barry says, the scientists found that the shroud was not a medieval painting, not a forgery, a hoax, a photograph, rubbing, etching, dust painting, or any of the other possibilities suggested by the doubters. Yet there were still doubters. If only we had some other piece of evidence to corroborate the story of the shroud. What many people don't realise is that we do. Fiercely protected behind lock and key at the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain, sits a great wooden ark. The metal front, fashioned in distinctly Roman style, shows the image of a man on what appears to be a throne, surrounded by 12 other figures. Legend has it that this chest was kept secretly in a cave near a monastery in Jerusalem until the 7th century.
Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away from the entrance. She went running to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved.
They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him.
Then Peter and the other disciple went to the tomb. The two of them were running, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and saw the linen cloths, but he did not go in. Behind him came Simon Peter, and he went straight into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the cloth which had been around Jesus' head. It was not lying with the linen cloths, but was rolled up by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in. He saw and believed.
When Persian invaders forced the monks to flee, taking the ark with them to Spain. They risked their lives to keep the box safe because of what it contains. Inside the Roman ark, at the cathedral in Oviedo, is a piece of cloth known as the Sudarium of Oviedo. Sudarium means shroud. It is said to be the cloth that was wrapped around Jesus' head when he was buried, as described in the Gospel of John. Blood tests conducted on the Sudarium and the Shroud of Turin prove that both are of the same blood type, AB, a rare blood type amongst medieval Europeans but common in the Middle East. What's more, pollen samples taken from both cloths place them both in the Palestine area, and textile experts have confirmed that the Sudarium is made from the same fabric as the shroud. Are the shroud and the Sudarium really linked? Look and ye shall find, said Jesus. There would seem to be no doubt that both the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo both covered the same man.